Hi, I'm Liz Whiteacre. Let's explore the art of storytelling. This week in class, our objectives are to review everything we've learned about the elements of a short story so far. You've already experienced all of these elements, not only in a fairy tale, but also in flash fiction or a very, very short story. We'll talk this week about how you can generate ideas for longer stories. We focused on maybe a 100-word story. What happens when it's a 2,000-word story? And we'll also think about some questions readers might ask themselves as they read, so we can make sure that we are writing engaging stories. The elements we're going to review today are narration. That is the way we have chosen to tell our story. It might be told from a point of view of someone on the outside by the author. It could also be told from the point of view of one of the characters in the story. We'll think about character today and who is populating our story. We'll think about plot and how we are having something happen in our stories, as well as setting, where the story takes place, and voice, the way you are writing the story, and also the choices you're making to, for example, make characters' voices unique and distinct throughout the story. You have a lot of choices. When you sit down to write a longer story or a shorter story or a novel, right? Lots of options here in the world of fiction. You're thinking about being a storyteller, so you do want to have an audience in mind. Are you expecting your work to be read digitally on someone's phone? That might affect how you choose to tell your story. Do you imagine your story being read aloud? Maybe you plan to perform your work and you won't be showing people what it looks like on the page. That's different too. If people are going to be reading it in hard copy, perhaps you ideally would like to see this published in, say, Etchings magazine. You can think about the style of storytelling and also the way stories are presented in a particular publication. It might change if it's something that's online. So who you're telling your story to will affect how you're telling your story, as well as the method that you're using. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration as you start your project. Narration also involves perspective. We talked earlier in the course about different types of points of view. We have our omniscient, and that is that all-knowing narrator who can tell us things from the past, the present, the future, who can go into the minds and lives of a bunch of different characters in the story, so that we have access as readers to everything. And then there's also limited omniscient, where perhaps only one character do we have access to as readers. So we follow around that person, either kind of on their shoulder if it's third person, or inside their head if it's first person. But we're really focused on knowing what that character is thinking and feeling as that character is acting. And then subjective point of view, think of that more as that movie camera. So you're kind of looking at everything, but you don't have access to the interior thoughts and feelings of the characters. So unless they say something out loud, unless their body language demonstrates something, an action that they've taken, something that they write down, we don't have access to any of the interior thoughts in that subjective point of view. And then once you think about what the perspective is going to be, you'll also, again, think about what point of view you're writing in. So is this going to be a first person story? I saw this, you won't believe it, right? Where we're using first person. Are we going to be using second person? You need to stop right now. You need to listen to this story. Do you know what happened to you? So as the writer, we are putting our reader in the driver's seat. And then third person, which is the most common point of view used, often in short stories, I'd say first and third person. That is our he, she, it, they, where we are looking at people a little bit more from the outside, whereas first person is more on the inside, and second person is that direct address to the reader. We have our characters. Again, a character may be the narrator. You might be telling the point of view from Pat, and Pat is going to share their experiences with us from that first person point of view. So we're kind of in Pat's mind and experiencing everything Pat is experiencing in the story. That would be a primary character who is the narrator. Sometimes the narrator is omniscient and apart. So we see Pat doing things, and that is that third person where Pat and their friends are doing these various activities. And we have those secondary characters, Pat's best friends, who are also a part of the story. And then there are characters who populate the world and are important because they help us understand how Pat's world functions, but we don't necessarily know much about them. For example, Pat is waiting on a really important piece of mail. Maybe Pat is going to find out whether or not they get to go to college of their choice. And the mail carrier comes and delivers that mail and leaves. Now, that mail character has Pat's future in that envelope and is going to make a huge difference in the story. But all the writer might say is the mail carrier. And all of us as readers are going to populate in our minds every male character that we've ever seen, or maybe the most recent one, and fill in the detail, fill in all the information that we need to know about that person making the delivery in that moment. We don't know what the mail carrier is thinking about. We don't know what that person's about to go off and do, what sort of adventure that will be. We don't know what that mail character's hope and dreams are for the future. So that would be considered a stock or flat character. We are working off stereotypes, and we are having that kind of 2D or 1D experience. They're there to help move the story forward, give it a backdrop like all the extras in a movie. We have our plot. And we often think about this as the action of the story, but it doesn't necessarily have to be exterior action. There are a lot of short stories that take place inside someone's mind, so there is not a lot of physical activity, but there is still a great sense of motion. Memories are being replayed, they're thinking about something that has happened, and decisions are being made. So a still, if you will, quiet piece can have just as much action as something with explosions. So don't necessarily limit yourself in terms of thinking about plot as specific things that are happening. I like to think of it personally a little bit more as action. How are things moving in the story, and how are we keeping our characters and our narrator and our readers moving forward? In our plot, we've talked a lot about different philosophies you can use, like Freytag's pyramid, the hero's journey, Kurt Vonnegut's plotting method, and there are many others. But we are thinking about moments of decision. And when you're writing longer stories and pieces, you might have more of those moments of decisions in between the catalyst or what happens in the story to kick things off. There might be a lot of little decisions along the way until we get to our climax, or that big decision, that moment of change where something has happened and the decision that the character makes in response to it has consequences. It might be growth, it might be affecting other people, but it's that moment of the story where we think, oh, things are about to change for this person, this world, this environment, these other characters. And then there will be some moments of decisions as the story wraps up and resolves itself. So you can think about those as plots, right on the graph between good fortune and ill fortune. We had some of our readings talk about emotional responses. Here I included this graphic because you can also kind of think about it, those different things happening that are filling us with different emotions as we move up and down with the characters. You could think about it as physical acts. I want to move out of my apartment. And so, what's the catalyst that gets me looking for a new apartment? Well, maybe I lose my job. And so I have to find a new one, right? And then I have to go through the process of visiting different apartments and figuring out which one is the best fit. And do I want someone to live with me? All of those different decisions along the way that ideally will end in a story, if it's a happier one, with my main character moving in and finally getting settled in that moment. And when we're thinking about the structure of our stories, we can think about them as linear and nonlinear. We've been writing shorter stories, and we've also been following archetypes of fairy tales. As you write your own longer short story, you're in the driver's seat, and you need to make some decisions about how you want your readers to experience things along with your characters. So linear would be in a straight line, right? We start on Monday, we go all the way through until Sunday, and we're following our characters through those days of the week. It could be 1 hour that's happening in your story. So something happens at noon, and that story takes us all the way to 1 o'clock p.m. Or maybe it's following someone a little bit in a lifetime, maybe the entire high school experience. Or if you can fit it in, it might be hard, maybe an entire lifetime. That wouldn't give us a lot of depth. And we'll talk about choosing topics for our stories in just a moment. And nonlinear would be not following that timeline. Maybe I start with a memory of my character in childhood, and then we fast forward to my character in their 30s, and then we go back to the character in the 20s, and then we go back to present time, right? So we're kind of moving back and forth. And because we're able to use characters' memories, people talking about past experiences, even flash forwards to the future, if we have that omniscient narrator and our narrator of the story wants to let us know, hey, our main character, Pat, doesn't know this, but they're about to be in a car accident, right? Let's zip back and follow very carefully the decisions that Pat's making up till that moment. So I'll take a moment to send Pat good vibes. I know it's hypothetical, but I always get nervous throwing those different types of ideas out into the world. All right. And transition to setting. Very fast, but we're going to leave happy thoughts with Pat and move forward. Setting is the location, the environment, the era, and where you put your people doing these different things is going to influence how you write your story, because the environment can pose different challenges. Sometimes you might have a setting or an environment that becomes a character. If we're thinking about all of the different weather-related issues happening in the world right now, a hurricane could be that villain, if you will, or the antagonist, and we have our main characters trying to prepare for that coming. Not to say that a hurricane is acting with sentient thought to do us harm specifically, but you could have that looming event, weather event, be something that the characters are working against in the particular story. And so how you're talking about the hurricane and paying attention to maybe how it's discussed in the news and using that to inform your story can be a big role, very different than if the weather, the location is not specifically acting on our characters. Maybe they're driving in a car and the scenery they're passing isn't important to them, so it's not important to the reader. And instead, we're focusing on that interior location. What is it like being in a closed space with that other person and trying to negotiate something between each other? That might be the focus. And of course, the era, the time period when things are happening can affect the different types of language choices you would make, the vocabulary that's being used, how people would speak in dialogue, what the cultural expectations are for the characters. And so all of those choices are going to influence how that story is written. And they're just as important as who the people are in the story and what's going to be happening. And finally, voice. And I always enjoy putting this in as an important element of literature because that voice is what is delivering the story to the readers. So, how does the story sound? As a writer, you might be creating a story in first person with a character very much like yourself. And so the story will sound like you. And it can be great when you're getting started to have a character that you feel very connected and close to, that you know, oh, well, they would say this in this moment because I know that I would. That's a great way to get started. Now, if you start adding in people to your story that you don't have a connection with, that you need to think a lot about, well, how would this person sound, because I don't have personal experience. You can always do some research to help you out. That's a wonderful thing to do, to make sure that your characters sound authentic. But let me tell you, right, the language choices that I would make to say something are going to be different than what you say to say something. And we're of the same culture right now, right? We're all a part of the UIndy culture, and we are thinking about the same subject matter, but those words that come to us and how we would say them are different. That becomes exponential when you're talking about people of different generations, people of different eras, people of different cultural backgrounds, people in different regions of the country. You might hear pop a lot at family reunions in Indiana when people are talking about what do you want to drink. You're not necessarily going to hear that if you visit another family, maybe on the East Coast, where they might say Coke or they might say soda. So just even little things like that, slang, all of those different things are going to make a big difference. How formal, how casual the story, or if it's a first person narrator, how formal or casual that speaker is, that character. And then the figurative language you choose is also going to be affected by the place, the time, the people, the setting, the actions, what's happening. You're going to make use of figurative language in all of the stories that you write, because it's a wonderful way to help readers be able to picture what things look like, how things sound, be able to make connections, and imagine what things are like when they don't have a common experience with the characters. But what you choose to use might differ depending, again, on what's happening in the piece and who your audience is. Generating ideas for longer stories. Let's say about 1,500 to 2,000 words. Something that I like to do, which helps me out, is think about a timeline. If I'm writing a 100-word story, I'm thinking about that moment under a microscope and really kind of drilling down to a moment of decision or a moment of epiphany. Now, if I'm looking at another, right, 1,000 to 2,000 words, I have a lot more time. So when I'm thinking about ideas for stories, I will often consider them in terms of the events or the personal growth that's going to happen before that moment and after that moment. And I will, on a piece of paper, kind of draw a line. And if I want to focus on a character's high school graduation, I would want to think about what were the significant moments in that person's educational or personal history, right? Kind of going back in time. Was it something really significant happened in second grade? Is it really maybe a divorce that happened in the family in eighth grade that then influenced who that person was during those high school years? So I'll kind of do a little sketch in terms of that person's lifetime, not like second by second, I don't have that kind of time. But what are some significant moments I'm imagining for this person? And then I'll start to play around. Okay, if I want this to be a 10-page story, what's an appropriate amount of time to cover? I could focus on the last month and know that I'm going to have to make a couple of references back to things that happened in the past for character growth, and also for readers to understand why the person is the way they are. I could also maybe consider the entire senior year if I'm able to kind of fast forward in jumps. It might be that final week of the senior year. I don't know your personal experience, but I know back in the day, we had a kind of a whole week's worth of different activities for seniors, to celebrate them, to make sure that they had time to spend with each other, and those sorts of things, leading up to the graduation. So I find that helpful to kind of think about that longer timeline and then zeroing in on a chunk of it and making sure that I've highlighted what's significant in flashbacks, say, along the way, or maybe in characters' conversations. The depth, breadth, and scope. You have heard about these terms, likely in other courses, especially composition. When we're thinking about depth, we're thinking about detail, right? Are we kind of dipping our toe into the shallow end of the pool, starting to test the waters, or are we diving right into the deep end? How much are we going to learn about these people, and how much time are we going to spend with them making decisions about things? The breadth of a story, just like a research project, etc., would be, imagine a map, right? How much ground are we going to cover? Are we covering an entire road trip across the United States? Are we just looking at Indiana, right? Are we just looking at a campus map? Are we looking at someone's details on the apartment layout? So you're kind of thinking about how much ground do you want to cover? How much detail do you want to be able to go into? And a short story, obviously, the more ground you cover, the less depth that you can have. And the smaller the ground you cover, the more depth that you can have. And if you find you need to cover a lot of ground with a lot of depth, probably you are starting work on a short story collection, or you're looking at a novella, or you're looking at a novel. Write down those ideas, keep them, but that would probably be a story that is not necessarily appropriate for the assignment this week, because you won't be able to execute it in its entirety. The other idea to think about is scope. I always like to think about a submarine periscope, right? It's coming up, and I have to physically move to be able to see that sliver up ahead of me because my blinders are on, right? I don't have my full range of vision. And that might be something you're thinking about in terms of, what am I going to focus on in the story? One character, a group of friends? So I've got 3 main characters that need to have growth, right? Am I going to focus on an entire town of people? So when we keep in mind what the focus is going to be, how much ground is going to be covered in what depth, that can help us start to negotiate before we even start putting pen to paper, exactly what we want to work with. And again, as you're writing stories, you're going to have great ideas for, say, spin-offs. Those are really popular with TV shows, right? Where you might mention a character in a story and then think, oh, that person is super interesting to me. I'm really excited about that person's backstory and what's happening to that person. And that's how we end up with novels written as a collection of short stories. So it's a genre, and it's definitely something that you can explore. But it's important to think about, well, can I fit both of these people's stories in the same story, or do they need to have their own separate stories? Character growth is another thing. What is happening, right? And how is what's happening affecting the character? A lot of times, people will think about, oh, this is a cool idea for something to happen, but they don't necessarily plan for or consider before writing what the point is. This is happening, but how is it affecting other people? a lot of times when we generally are living our own lives, we don't have that type of insight in the moment. And it comes later on where we think, oh, this was a significant moment in my life. Um, as a writer of a short story, you should have that kind of hindsight before you get started. Some people shared in their video responses that they just start writing. And that can be a great way to start generating ideas for the page. But when you're planning that story, you should have an intention for what kind of growth do I want to see for this person. So as I'm making choices along the way and challenging my character, how the character responds is going to be meaningful to my readers so that they don't just feel like perhaps they're watching a fish tank, which can be really relaxing. I have owned many fish tanks. I love them. You just sit back, kind of watch. But because I'm a writer, it amuses my family. I'm always coming up with backstories. Like, what's that fish got to do with that fish? And how's that fish feeling today? So I'm coming to the piece already trying to make those connections. But you do want to make sure that as the reader is sitting there experiencing this, that they have a sense of why am I involved, why am I watching this, why am I getting a glimpse at this, so that there's some sort of payoff at the end. And having that intention before you get started can be helpful as well. And finally, point of view. I mentioned narrator. If you have one person you can follow and you feel comfortable developing that voice, first person might be a great way to go for your first longer story, especially if that character might be a little bit connected to you and you feel very confident that you can say what that person thinks. That might be a fun choice to do for this very first story. If you're unsure and you would like to focus on more than just one main character to start because I don't know if I have enough of an idea for that one person, you might want to choose third person and pick 1 to 2 primary characters and have them go through the experience together and have them both grow during the story, either maybe growing apart or growing together. That can be something that can be helpful for generating that longer story idea. And certainly as you are planning and preparing and executing this week, don't hesitate to get in touch if you feel a little overwhelmed or a little lost. It's very easy to say, oh, writer's block, can't do it. I'm blocked, right? But I found that as other writers have advised you through our readings and videos in the course, doing something makes that go away, right? Just doing something. So get in touch and we'll talk about that something. You can certainly pull ideas from other writing assignments you've done for the course right now and generate those into a longer story. Finally, writing engaging stories. What can we do? These are questions that I always imagine my readers asking when I am writing a story or once I finish the first draft of my story. And I find it really helpful to consider it from the reader's point of view sometimes. It helps me make choices as I am composing and revising. So the first one readers might ask is, why is this happening? If there's no sense of, again, something significant about the events or how the characters feel about them, it can leave readers feeling a little like, why did I just spend 20 minutes reading this story? I got nothing from it. And at least that next question, I'm not taking anything away from it. So it is important to be intentional. If you're going to have a character hide something in their room, why? If it doesn't tell me something about that person's character at the beginning or maybe the middle of the story, if I don't see that person take it out and reveal it very intentionally and make a big step forward, like, I'm not going to hide this anymore, I'm going to share this with people, even though I might be rejected or ridiculed or shamed, I'm doing it. I might wonder at the end of the story, well, where's that hidden thing and what was up with that? So that can be important too. There's the old cliche of, hey, if you put a loaded gun in the story, it better go off at some point, right? Also, I like to think about, can I picture this? As I'm reading, can I see it as a movie in my mind? You don't need to explain every single detail to your readers. And in a lot of your video responses, you yourself as a reader have shared, I like to be able to make things up and picture things and add things to the story as I'm reading it. But there should be enough in that framework so that I can picture what's happening and then fill in those details myself. You may never tell me what color hair your character has. I might be filling that in, but it could be suggested to me based on other elements of the stories, like geographical location, maybe how they're talking, things they're into. I could start to picture, like, oh, that character totally has teal hair, right? um, which would work if I've got kind of a punk vibe feeling from a younger person. Maybe not so much with someone's grandma, right? Unless it's really clear that that grandma is rocking it. Another thing I like to think about is, can I feel this as a reader? Can I feel this too? If I never know how the characters feel about things, and I always have to guess, as a reader, I'm going to feel a little bit unsure whether or not I'm interpreting things correctly. And so that's something to kind of think about too. There's no indication that the characters care at all about what's happening to them, and that how they feel has changed in the story, and it's very distant. As a reader, I'm probably going to get a little bit frustrated, and likely you do too. And the stories that you love most are ones that you might smile during it, or you might feel sad. Maybe you start crying. Maybe it makes you mad as you go. So we're kind of feeling things along with the characters, and that can help make sure that your story is an engaging one. Do I get lost in the story is a little misleading. Right? As a reader, I don't want to get confused in the story and be like, what is happening? By lost, I mean, can I immerse myself and get lost in the story because I become a part of it, and I forget what time it is, and I forget that I need to feed myself, right? And I keep turning pages and I don't want it to end. And I get done, I'm like, hey, family, you got to read this story. Not that I do that with your rough drafts. Don't get concerned. I'm thinking about the published work that I read and I share with friends and family. I would never share your work without permission. But that's something to consider. And also, can I connect? I love reading stories personally when they are about people who are not like me. And I feel such a strong connection to those people because the writers have let me in. They've shown me how those people see the world. They've shown me how they feel about the world. They show me how they respond to challenges and triumphs. And I feel a strong connection to them. And that can be done by, again, making sure that we have some sort of sense of how the characters are responding to things and how they feel about that. Also making sure that we explain why things are happening. So all of these things are connected. And as you're drafting or you're about to make a decision about what you want to happen, you might take a step back for a moment and look at the story as a bigger picture and think, okay, how might my reader be feeling about this in a moment? And am I going to do something the reader expects? Or am I going to do something totally different that they might be uncomfortable with, or like, whoa, but then it's going to make sense later on because I'm going to explain it to them why that character made a very unusual choice or why that random thing happened. This is going to be a fun week. Your assignment is to write a short story, but it's up to you what you'd like to write about. And I do appreciate that that can be overwhelming. There are suggestion prompts. We've had prompts throughout the course. You're welcome to go back to those short story prompts and try some out to get you generating ideas. If you feel lost, writer's blocky, confused, overwhelmed, unsure, maybe you get started halfway and then you're not sure what to do, check in with me. Send me a message and I'm very happy to help you talk about your draft as you go. You can also visit office hours, and as a community, we can talk a little bit about what people are struggling with and also give each other some advice. Hey, I think this would be cool, or I'd love to know more about that. You can also take a piece that has been very short, and if it is very compelling to you and people in workshop have asked you a lot of questions, well, what about this or what happened there? That might be one that you'd like to expand and tell us more about that world and those characters that you've already developed. So this week we're focusing on the short story. Next week, we're going to focus on the personal essay and talk about how can we use all of these storytelling skills for your own life and exploring what you feel about things with your readers. I cannot wait to see what you create. Take care and keep in touch.